Back in September, I was able to teach this class, and at that time I began a study on the subject of instrumental music in the worship service of the church. And what I had talked about then was putting together a series of lessons, because if people have questions about instrumental music in the worship of the church, it's really not a short answer. So many times we want a quick and a short answer. There's really more to it than most people realize. I wanted to teach on this subject because I do believe that it's relevant. It's probably more relevant than we realize. Across the country, there are churches of Christ who are even introducing the musical instruments into their worship services in some form or fashion. And it follows along the same line as many other innovations. So some of the same things that we would look at on this subject would follow the same course of study on other innovations as well. So tonight I want to continue along that line with what I would call the second episode, or the second part of this series. What I'm hoping to do is just anytime that I have the opportunity to teach, I'll add another one until I cover the things that I would like to get covered here. I want to start out Hebrews chapter 12 tonight. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible. It's a pretty new version of translation. It gets pretty solid reviews, and over the few years that it's been out, it seems to be a pretty reliable version. But if you notice that this is a little bit different than what's in your Bible, that may be the reason. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 28 and 29. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable for worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. So here we just see from this verse, our worship to God is something that is important to us, and it's important to God. First of all, I want to do hopefully a quick review of what we talked about last time. We had a few questions last time. I think it was a good foundation for this study, and it would also be a good foundation for many studies of this type. But the first question that I ask is, as far as arguments might go, is, does it really matter? A lot of people might think, well, it just doesn't really matter. So we need to ask that question, does it really matter? In the last class, we saw that, yes, it does matter. And it matters because God is sovereign. Isaiah chapter 46, verses 9 and 10. Isaiah chapter 46, verses 9 and 10 says, remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me. So God is sovereign. Also in Psalms chapter 29, verse 10. It says, the Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. So it does matter because God is sovereign, God reigns, and we are to worship God. God gave us standards to go by. God is king, God reigns, so we go by His standards. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 and 17 says that we have everything that we need to be complete, thoroughly furnished for the study of God and study of His Word, to know what He wants. John chapter 4, verse 23 and 24. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship Him. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and in truth. So if God is king and He's given us the law to go by, the rules to go by, His word to go by, we've got to submit to Him and obey Him and worship Him according to His will. This requires submission, our submission to Him. He is the King. We must submit to Him. We have to do it God's way. We have to put our way, what we want, aside. There have been several lessons from our pulpit here on submission. Lonnie Jones, back on September 18th, had a lesson on being crushed, being broken, submitting to God, submitting to His will. And it's a thing that we don't like to do. We want to do things our way. But we have to submit to God. And when we talk about submitting to God, we've got to understand that it involves every aspect of worship. It involves the aspect of how we live our lives and what we do. So we have to submit to God and do what He says His way. We also looked at God's standard in the Old Testament. We saw that musical instruments were used in the temple worship of the Old Testament. So we see and we can know and we can study in the Old Testament and know that God knew then what musical instruments were. He knows now what musical instruments are. Musical instruments were used in the temple worship in the Old Testament, but it wasn't just random. It wasn't just at the will of the people. God gave them commands on specific instruments to use, told them how to use them and when to use them. He gave them instructions and authorized their use. In the Old Testament, it was commanded in temple worship. It wasn't optional. It wasn't something they could take or they could leave because they did have that authorization. He was specific about what He wanted and how He wanted it. If He wanted instrumental music in New Testament worship, we can look in the Old Testament and see that God knew everything there was. He set that standard in the Old Testament. If He wanted it in New Testament worship, He knew what it was and He could have authorized it. He would have authorized it if He did want it, but He did not do so. So that's a quick review of what we talked about last time. And I think the most important thing there is that it really is important because we must worship God in the way that God tells us to. Tonight I want to do more of a history lesson. I want to look at instrumental music through the ages, through the years, and see what we can learn just from history about the use of instrumental music in the worship service. In the next lesson, I would probably begin to move on into some arguments for instrumental music that people may come up with. I would say the first argument, and if I get to it tonight, I may even do it, is I just like it. Probably the most honest argument there is. I want to do it just because I like it. And that, along with some other arguments that people pose. And then probably to close out the series of lessons somewhere down the road, if I ever get to that, I would probably take a look at Ephesians chapter 5 and Colossians chapter 3. Not just a verse or two that we refer to in there, but I want to look at those in the context that they have to make sure that we're looking at those the way that they should be and to learn the lessons that there are to be learned in that. And as you see, if we follow that program, the study is much broader than just one quick answer or one quick verse or two. There's more to it to look at. And we need to do that. We need to always be studying so that we have a strong foundation. So when people ask us questions, we can give them an answer. And if we don't have the answer on the tip of our tongue, we at least know that we can study and go and find the answer. This is where I need my table. One of the points that I'm going to make tonight and that I want you to see is that the question of instrumental music in the worship of God is not a Church of Christ issue. It is much broader than that. To us, that's what we see. It's one of the most obvious things that people may see when they come to worship with us is that we don't have instruments of music in our worship. And they may wonder why, and they may have questions of that. I've grown up in the church, so I've never really been exposed to anything other than that. But I think so many people, we see it on TV, if we do go visit somewhere else, instrumental music are so deeply ingrained in denominations and places all over the world that we just assume that it's always been that way. And we assume that we are the only ones that even have ever questioned it. And so one of the main things that I think we'll see by looking through this historical study this evening is that we're not the only people who ever question it. There are honest people throughout the centuries that study, that have questions, that come to different conclusions. And so I hope by doing that it'll broaden your mind and help you realize that this is not just some little nitpicky thing that the Church of Christ has chosen and we're going to be different from everybody else in the world and we're not going to budge on it. It is much more than that. It's the Word of God. One point that Carrie brought out in the last class, and I thought it was a very important point because we looked at the worship in the Old Testament. And the move from the Old Testament worship to the New Testament worship was a move from the physical worship, the physical things of the law, to the spiritual nature of worship today. And the musical instruments of the Old Testament worship were physical in nature. Singing, making melody in our heart is a spiritual nature in our worship today. And as we study, we're going to see that more and more because that is a common thing that people throughout the centuries have seen and have commented on. When I talk about it, the issue not being just something within the church that is studied and talked about, one point that I thought was kind of interesting, I've got one book here that I think is an excellent book on the subject. Another book that I've got that I've been using along with this book at home, and then some other books as well. But the interesting thing that I found when I began to really study the subject, the book that I've got at home is a book by John L. Girardeau. He is a Presbyterian. Anytime that you start studying this subject, most anybody within the church, even in other places that are studying this subject, will refer to his book. It's a Presbyterian who is studying the role of instrumental music in the worship. He has gone through and proven over and over that instrumental music does not belong in the worship of the New Testament church. He's a Presbyterian. It's one of the major books that people refer to, major author on this subject. That book, I don't know for sure how long it's been out, but it's a significant enough book that Foy L. Wallace wrote a book on instrumental music. And Foy L. Wallace's books are always big, thick books. He uses many words. He covered the subject. He covered some debates that he had had in it. He discovered the things that he had looked at and studied. He included the entire copy of that book in his book on instrumental music. Also, Winford Claiborne of the Gospel Hour up in Fayetteville. They print a lot of books. He has reprinted this book for use today because it's such a significant book. And that's where my copy came from. John L. Girardeau is a Presbyterian, so we have to look for the things that, and realize that he's going to have some things in there that we disagree with as far as doctrine goes, but as far as the subject of instrumental music and worship, he is pretty much dead on. Anytime we use a book by somebody else, Jim Ashworth told me that Gus Nichols had always told him that it's kind of like a mule that's eating in the briars. He chomps, and when he gets to a briar, he spits it out. But he keeps on eating. So when you find something like that, and other people say eat the fish but not the bones, find the good stuff in it. So there's a Presbyterian that is a major reference on the use of instrumental music in the worship of the New Testament church. This book is a more modern book. The name of this book is Old Light and New Worship. Musical Instruments and the Worship of God, a Theological, Historical, and Psychological Study. And it's by John Price. John Price is a Baptist. This book also refers to John L. Gerardo a lot, but I think it's a very well-written book, and it's laid out really well. It's almost scary to think that within the Church of Christ, when you get ready to study the subject of instrumental music, you can almost have to look outside of the church writers, modern-day church writers, to find a good book on the subject. Not to say that there aren't any, because I know there's 2 or 3 at least from writers from within the church, and also some that are reviewed as well. But to find Presbyterians that are opposed to it, Baptists that are opposed to it, and we'll see how it went through church history to see that this is not a Church of Christ modern-day issue. It's something that's been looked at. Honest hearts open their Bibles, they look at it, and they come to the same conclusions. First of all, I want to look just real quick at, in the New Testament times, worship in the synagogue. We talked about worship in the temple the last class that we had, but in the New Testament times, in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the synagogue had begun to play a major role in the life of the Jews. The Jews had been in captivity. They'd been dispersed all over the world. They were not all in Jerusalem where they could go to the temple. So the synagogue had developed and become a major part of the Jewish worship and the Jewish life. The main thing that I want to point out here is that the temple worship and the synagogue worship were 2 different things. We know that the temple worship from the last study that we had instrumental music. They were authorized. They were used. But according to writers and historians, instrumental music was not used in the synagogues. Synagogues were different than the temple. They were in cities all over the place. The temple was in Jerusalem. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 16 tells us about the 3 times that a Jewish man was supposed to go to the temple. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 16 says, 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, at the feast of unleavened bread, at the feast of weeks, and the feast of booths. They shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Those are also known as Feast of the Passover, the Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So we know as we study the New Testament, Joseph had to go to, in the day of Pentecost, all the Jews were going to the Pentecost for that reason, because all male Jews had to go to the temple at Pentecost. So that's why the church began there, because the Old Testament prophesied that it would. That worked into God's plan because all the male Jews are supposed to be there, supposedly millions of people there. So when the gospel began, the audience was there for it. So there were 3 times a year that every male had to go to the temple in Jerusalem. But we know that they worshiped every Sabbath day. That was done in the synagogue. Acts chapter 15, verse 21. It says, for from ancient generations Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. So there is a difference between the temple worship and the synagogue worship. I'm going to refer to this John Price book for the next few minutes just because it's easier than rewriting all this stuff myself. Concerning the Jewish synagogue and worship in the Jewish synagogue, musical instruments had been commanded by God in the temple in Jerusalem, but they were never introduced into the worship of the synagogues. It was the unaccompanied singing of psalms that became an important feature of the synagogue worship. Professor Gerardo writes, in regard to the synagogue, its worship was destitute of instrumental music. No instrumental music entered into the services of the Jewish synagogue. Instrumental music is not known to have been used in connection with this worship. This just shows that the Jews were not accustomed to using instrumental music in their worship. So it wouldn't have followed that the Christians would have even picked that up and brought it into their worship in the New Testament, because it wasn't something that they were accustomed to. It wasn't something that they were used to. So it wasn't something that they would have just brought into the New Testament worship just because it's something that they had already been accustomed to doing. So instrumental music was not known to have been used in the synagogue worship. We know that worship in the synagogue and the worship of the Jews was separate and different and left behind at the establishment of the church, but that just gives you a background to look at. I want to keep on looking on through the next few hundred years and look at the writings and the history of the church as it developed in the 1st and 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries. Look at the attitudes and opinions of some of the early church fathers. The early church fathers, as they're referred to, were writers and members of the church as it was known then. As you go on through the years, these people may have been associated with the Catholic Church or denominations that have developed, but they were the historians of those times. Some of them were as early as the 1st century, even students of John, and then further down the years, they may have been further and further away from the New Testament church, but we still can study and see what their attitudes were concerning the use of instrumental music in worship. Some of those early church fathers are people, and I read this because I'd heard some of these names for years, and I'm not going to give you a biography of each one of them, but it's just to give you an idea of the direction I'm going. Some of those are like Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, Irenaeus of Lyon, Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, Maximus the Confessor, Tertullian, Jerome, Augustine, Gregory the Great. These people, while they were not apostles, they may have even been associated with people who fell away from the church and into a denominational world, and which eventually led to the Catholic Church and other things. But we can look at their study of the Scripture, their attitude toward instrumental worship, instrumental music in the worship of the church, and see that we can learn some lessons as to the attitudes over the years. I'm going to read just a few of them. I could bury you for the next hour probably in reading names of people that I had to look up how to pronounce them and everything else. But I'm just going to read a few of them just so you will see, and then I will tell you what's consistent among them. The first is Ignatius. He was one of the earliest church fathers. Wherefore it is fitting that you should run together in accordance with the will of the bishop, which thing you also do. Let me see, I just lost my spot. Okay, and do ye, man by man, become a choir, that being harmonious in love and taking up the song of God in unison, yet may with one voice sing to the Father through Jesus Christ. So they sang in their worship. Justin Martyr, he's a name that I was more familiar with, and you may have heard. Justin Martyr, who lived from about 100, the year 100. Remember, John died about the year 100, the Apostle John. So Justin Martyr, who lived from about 100 to about 165, was the leading apologist of the early church in the face of intense Roman persecution. His defense of Christianity ultimately led to his martyrdom. Concerning the distinction between Old and New Covenant worship, Martyr wrote about 140 A.D. The use of singing with instrumental music was not received in the Christian churches as it was among the Jews in their infant state, but only the use of plain song. So he says the use of singing with instrumental music was not received in the Christian churches. This is about 140 A.D. Only the use of plain song. Clement of Alexandria, who lived from about 150 to about the year 215, he was another scholar of the early church. He based his objection to musical instruments upon their association with idolatry and immorality. In that time frame, they associated these things with immoral behavior of the pagans, the idolatry that the pagans did, and so even with that influence, they thought it was best to stay away from them. He says, leave the pipe to the shepherd, the flute to the men who are in fear of gods and are intent on their idol worshiping. Such musical instruments must be excluded from our wineless feast. Clement believed that the instruments of the Old Testament were now replaced by the instrument of the human body. Praise him with harp, for the tongue is a harp of the Lord. And with the lute praise him, understanding the mouth as the lute moved by the Spirit. So even he believed that they had moved from that physical to the spiritual, from the physical of the lute and the harp to the spirit of the tongue and the mouth. Origen was a pupil of Clement and perhaps the greatest scholar of the early church fathers. He lived from about 185 to 254. He says the kithra, which is the lyre, is the active soul being moved by the commandments of God. The psalterion, which is the harp, is the pure mind being moved by spiritual knowledge. The musical instruments of the Old Covenant understood spiritually are applicable to us. So the instruments of the Old Covenant are now spiritual, and as spiritual they are applicable to us. The kithra, speaking figuratively, is the body. The psalterion, the spirit. These are in tune for the wise man who employs the members of the body and power of the soul as strings. He who makes melody with the mind makes melody well, speaking spiritual songs and singing in his art to God. Eusebius is another name that was more familiar. He lived from about 260 A.D. to 339. Eusebius was the bishop of Caesarea. He was a leading historian of the early church. If musical instruments had existed in the worship of the church, he surely would have recorded their use. But Eusebius states that it was the universal practice of the churches to sing unaccompanied psalms. So over and over again, we see in those first few hundred years, musical instruments were not used in the worship services. So they did not bring them over from the New Testament church into their worship. It was not part of their history. It was not part of their writings. It was not part of the commentary that they made on their studies. Next, I'll look at Jerome. Jerome lived from about 340 to 420. Jerome is an important person. You may be more familiar with him. You might not be familiar with his name, but you will be familiar with something that he did. Jerome was unsurpassed as a scholar in the early church. His greatest achievement was the translation of the Bible into Latin from the original languages. He is the one who translated the Vulgate. He rejected the use of instrumental instruments on the basis of their immoral associations and stated that a Christian maiden ought not even to know what a lyre or a flute is or even what it's used for. That's how much opposed they were to the use of musical instruments, not only in the worship of the church, but even in life in general. even getting away from individual people. And I think that we understood that there were different councils along the years, and that different groups got together and made up different creeds. And we are not associated with those, and we don't believe that those are gospel and that those are inspired. But even some of those groups, when they got together and made some of their writings together, they opposed instrumental music in the worship. The Council of Laodicea in 367 AD forbid the use of musical instruments in worship, and this remained the policy of the Eastern Orthodox Church to the present day. So they still don't use instrumental music, instruments of music in the worship. In the year 416, the Council of Carthage addressed this issue and declared, "On the Lord's day, let all instruments of music be silenced." So even in those councils, they condemned the use of instrumental music in worship. And we're still coming up through the years, hundreds of years as we go. Even Gregory the Great, according to McClintock and Strong, who toward the end of the 6th century added greatly to the existing church music, absolutely prohibited the use of instruments. So Gregory the Great, in the 6th century, 600 years later, still prohibiting the use of instrumental music in the worship. Jump up about 600 years later to about 1225, the 1200, maybe 1250. Okay, this is 1,250 years after Christ. I always use this as a reference to me, and I've said it here, I know, several times. I look at the United States, became a nation just over 200 years ago, and that seems like forever and ever. Here we're looking at 1,250 years. So it's easy to just throw out numbers and those things just not seem like that much. But we've only been a nation for just over 200 years. And here we've crossed over about 1,250 years. Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 to 1274, was one of the most prominent Roman Catholic theologians of the Middle Ages. One who surely knew how worship was conducted in his time. As late as 1260, he wrote, "The church does not use musical instruments such as the harp or lyre when praising God, in case she should seem to fall back into Judaism. For musical instruments usually move the soul more to pleasure than create inner moral goodness. But in the Old Testament, they used instruments of this kind both because the people were more coarse and carnal, so they needed to be aroused by such instruments and with worldly promises, and also because these bodily instruments were symbolic of something." Cajetan, a Roman Catholic cardinal of the 16th century, said, "It is to be observed the church did not use organs in Thomas's time, whence even to this day the Church of Rome does not use them in the Pope's presence." So even though these are reference to Roman Catholic people, we see they are still opposed to the use of instrumental music in worship, and state that they are not used and have not been used. Along about the year 650, an organ was introduced into some of the Roman Catholic worship. It was introduced with great opposition, great argument. It kind of faded off to the wayside. So even over the years, it had began to make a crack in the door, starting to seep in, to get a foothold. But even 600 years after that first time that an instrument had been introduced, it still not had become part of the New Testament worship, according to those who we have records of, even though their New Testament worship was not what we consider proper New Testament worship, being from the Roman Catholics and denominations, they still opposed the use of instrumental music in worship. Cotton Mather is another interesting individual. He was in the United States. Writing in about 1700, he states, "Instrumental music in the worship of God is but a very late invention and corruption in the church of the New Testament. The writings that go under the name of Justin Martyr deny it and decry it. Chrysostom speaks meanly of it. Even Aquinas himself, about 400 years ago, determines against it as Jewish and carnal. Bellarmine himself confesses that it was but late conceived in the church. So by 1700, musical instruments were being used, but they were a new innovation in the 1700s, and it was still opposed. I'm going to have to pick it up. Like I said, I could go on and on with references. The common theme throughout the years, hundreds of years, is that instrumental music was not part of New Testament worship. It was not even considered. In the early years, it wasn't argued against because it wasn't even used. The reason that it was mentioned and brought up is when they would be studying in the Psalms or commenting on different verses, they would make mention of things like that. But it wasn't even an argument then. I want to look at just a few more examples that are I think that we may be able to relate to more. I mentioned them briefly in the first lesson. I want to go a little bit more in depth in the last few minutes that we have. I'm going to read from a sermon by Alan Hires, and this comes from The Spiritual Sword. I've got this sermon on DVD, and it's interesting to listen to. I'm just going to read a few excerpts from it. One section is, Do Presbyterians Know? Like I said, we may assume that this is a Church of Christ issue, that it is something that is just our pet peeve. But we should by now see that it's not something that is just recently that we kick around and want to just make our little whipping boy. Do Presbyterians know? John Calvin is one of the great names in theology. John Calvin, he may not have wanted to be, he may not have meant to be, but he was the founder of the Presbyterian Church, and we're all familiar with Calvinism, the 5 tenets of Calvinism. John Calvin said, musical instruments in celebrating the praises of God will be no more suitable than the burning of incense, the lighting of lamps, and the restoration of other shadows of the law. So John Calvin, the founder of the Presbyterian denomination, was opposed to musical instruments in worship. Have the Methodists heard? Adam Clark is one of the great commentators of all time, of our time, of even time. I would be willing to bet that a lot of people here either have a copy of Adam Clark's commentaries, have had them, or have referred to them in study. Adam Clark is one of the greatest Methodist commentators who ever lived. And Adam Clark, being a Methodist, he lived during the time of John Wesley, who was the founder of the Methodist denomination. Adam Clark said, music as a science I esteem and admire, but instruments of music in the house of God I abominate and abhor. So Adam Clark was a great Methodist commentator. He was opposed to instrumental music in worship, the Methodist. Now, Adam Clark, I said, knew John Wesley. I was in Savannah a few weeks ago, and I did not realize that John Wesley built his first church in the United States in Savannah, so I saw that building. I didn't go inside it. We did kind of the whirlwind thing. I would have liked to have gone back just for historical reasons. But I saw that building, that John Wesley, that church, which was his first church in the United States. But Adam Clark knew John Wesley, and he made this statement concerning John Wesley. He said, the late, venerable, and most eminent divine, the Reverend John Wesley, who was a lover of music and an elegant poet, when asked his opinion of instruments of music being introduced into the chapels of the Methodists, said, in his terse and powerful manner, I have no objection to instruments of music in our chapels, provided they are neither heard nor seen. So, do the Presbyterians know that their roots are opposed to instrumental music in worship? Do the Methodists know that their roots grow into the opposition of instrumental music in worship? Well, what about the Baptists? I already told you that I had one book by a Presbyterian and one book by a Baptist here. The greatest Baptist preacher who ever lived was a man by the name of Charles Spurgeon. just lots of books are still around about the sermons of Charles Spurgeon. He wrote a series of books on the Psalms that are a major work today. If you want a book that covers all the Psalms and gives you insights into them, it's called The Treasury of David. That's by Charles Haddon Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon lived in the 1800s. He was a preacher, the greatest preacher, the Baptist preacher in London, England. He was a preacher of the Metropolitan Baptist Tabernacle. They had a membership of over 10,000 people. Several things that I could read from Charles Spurgeon. He said, "What a degradation to supplant the intelligent song of the whole congregation by the theatrical prettiness of a quartet, the refined niceties of a choir, or the blowing off of wind from inanimate bellows and pipes." A famous sentence that Charles Spurgeon wrote, "We may as well pray by machinery as praise by it." Charles Spurgeon, the greatest Baptist preacher of all time, was opposed to the use of instrumental music, and he would not allow it in his church. He had the biggest church in the world, the biggest Baptist church in the world. He would not allow instruments of music in his church. Here's what David Benedict, one of the greatest historians of the Baptist, had to say about the Baptist. "Staunch old Baptists in former times would have as soon tolerated the Pope of Rome in their pulpits as an organ in their galleries. And yet the instrument has gradually found its way among them in their successors in church management, with nothing like the jars and difficulties which arose of old concerning the bass viol and the smaller instruments of music." So there you have, do the Presbyterians know? Do the Methodists know? Do the Baptists know? What the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and the Baptists know and believe and teach is not important to us. What the Bible teaches is important to us. What the men in the year 100, 200, 300, what they did, what they taught is not what we base what we do on. But we can look at these records, these historians, their progression through the years, and that can give us credence, a way to understand and believe that musical instruments were not used in the worship, not in the New Testament church. It did not spill over into the 1st century, the 2nd century, the 3rd century. It was not until the 600s that it was even began to be introduced, and even after the 1200s that it began to take a bigger foothold. We look around us today and we see how prominent it is in the denominational world, and how it's one of the major differences between the Church of Christ and the world. When somebody comes in and says, "Well, why don't y'all use instruments of music?" They don't, most of them would not even know what their history is in it. We go past all of their history. We go past all of those years that we've talked about. We go back to the New Testament. We do God's things God's way. God is king. It matters because it matters to Him. We worship Him the way that He says for us to worship Him. Thank you all very much.